The Williams family set out for what was supposed to be a relaxing getaway in the Appalachian Mountains. A simple week away from the pressures of daily life, time to hike, bond, and enjoy the fresh air. But their vacation quickly took a dangerous and life-changing turn when a routine stop turned into a nightmare they never saw coming. What started as a peaceful escape would soon thrust them into a frightening encounter that none of them could have imagined. Marcus and Tamara Williams, along with their two children, Xavier and Mia, had worked tirelessly for years, putting their careers and responsibilities above all else. Marcus, a committed FBI agent, had spent much of his life in service, tackling sensitive cases that often kept him away from home. Tamara, a dedicated school teacher, had devoted herself to the education and well-being of her students. Their children, Xavier and Mia, were equally focused on their futures. Xavier, a determined high school senior, was preparing for college and hoping to secure a basketball scholarship, while Mia, a budding photographer, was eager to explore the beauty of the mountains and document the world through her lens. This trip was meant to be a break from the intensity of their everyday lives. The family had rented a cabin in the heart of the mountains, choosing a peaceful, quiet town as their destination. They envisioned a week of slow mornings exploring nature and simply enjoying each other's company. It was a rare opportunity to unplug, recharge, and make memories together. The small town they entered seemed to be the perfect place for their escape. Quiet streets, little traffic, and only a few locals going about their business. Everything about the town felt calm, unhurried, and safe. The family had no reason to suspect that anything could go wrong. But as they stopped for a meal at a local diner, the unease they felt would soon escalate into something far worse than any of them could have prepared for. The town near the Williams cabin was small, its streets lined with weathered shops and modest homes. The quiet atmosphere seemed untouched by the pressures of modern life. There were no bustling crowds, no crowded stores, just the occasional car passing by, a few locals chatting on street corners, and the distant hum of life moving at its own pace. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, offering the perfect environment for a family in need of a break. The Williams family immediately felt at ease. The usual hustle and bustle of their city lives seemed like a distant memory in this calm, rural setting. As Marcus drove through the town's main street, the family took in the simple beauty of their surroundings. They exchanged excited comments about what they would do over the next few days. Xavier talked about the hiking trails he couldn't wait to explore, while Mia, always with her camera ready, thought about the pictures she could capture. Tamara, enjoying the quiet, relaxed pace, commented on how much the trip was already helping her unwind. It was a place where they could all exhale, where no one would rush them or expect anything of them. They were just another family, on their way to a cabin to enjoy some well-earned time away. Little did they know, their arrival would soon shift from tranquility to something much more uncomfortable. The family decided to stop at a local diner for a bite to eat. It was small, with a few tables occupied by locals chatting softly. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and grilled food. A waitress, friendly and welcoming, showed them to a booth, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. They placed their orders and sat back, enjoying the casual pace of the meal. The locals didn't seem to pay much attention to the Williams family at first, each person wrapped up in their own conversations. But there was something about the place that made the family feel both welcomed and out of place. As Marcus looked around, he noticed that the other diners seemed to be mostly white. He brushed it off, chalking it up to the small-town nature of the area. He didn't expect any problems. After all, they were just a family looking for a meal in a quiet town. Xavier, ever the talkative one, struck up a conversation with the waitress about the area, asking for recommendations on local attractions. Mia quietly surveyed the room through the lens of her camera, snapping photos of the worn-down wooden walls and the cozy diner ambiance. Tamara leaned back in her seat, grateful for a moment of peace, her mind wandering to the days ahead. The family had no reason to expect anything unusual. The food arrived, and they continued to enjoy their meal, laughing and chatting as they always did. The peacefulness of the moment lingered. But as they finished and prepared to leave, the quiet of the town would be shattered by an unexpected turn of events. As they left the diner and walked toward their car, something in the air felt different. Marcus couldn't put his finger on it, but there was an undeniable tension. As soon as they got into the car and started pulling out of the parking lot, the sound of sirens broke the stillness. Within seconds, 2 police cars appeared from behind, their lights flashing and sirens blaring, forcing the family to come to a halt. Marcus instinctively slowed the car, his mind racing. "What's going on?" Tamara muttered under her breath, glancing nervously out of the window. The officers had already surrounded their vehicle, stepping out of their cars with guns drawn. The family was stunned into silence, unable to understand what was happening. One officer approached the driver's side, his hand resting on his gun, as he gestured for Marcus to roll down the window. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered, his tone sharp and unwelcoming. Marcus, always calm under pressure, did as he was told, though confusion and concern started to build in his mind. "Sir, we're just passing through," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We've done nothing wrong." He held up his hands in a non-threatening manner, trying to signal that he was not a threat. But the officer didn't respond to his calm demeanor. Instead, he barked the same command. "Out of the vehicle now." Without further explanation, the officer gestured to his colleagues, who began to approach the rest of the family. The situation quickly grew tense. Marcus, now outside the car, tried to reason with the officers, but his attempts to defuse the situation fell on deaf ears. "I'm an FBI agent," he explained, his voice measured. "We're on vacation. Please, there's been a mistake." One officer scoffed, seemingly uninterested in Marcus's identification. "FBI agent, huh?" he muttered. "Then why do you look so out of place?" The officer's words stung, but Marcus kept his composure, aware that his calmness could help defuse the situation. But the questioning continued, becoming more aggressive as more officers surrounded the family. Tamara, now visibly frightened, tried to advocate for her children. "Why are you doing this? We haven't done anything wrong," she demanded, but her voice was shaky and the officers ignored her pleas. They turned their attention to Xavier and Mia, demanding that they step out of the car. Xavier, confused and nervous, glanced at his father, looking for reassurance, but Marcus's face had hardened. The officers' questions became more pointed. They asked why the family was in town, why they were looking so suspicious, and whether Marcus was lying about his job. The racial profiling was clear. The officers were focused on their skin color and appearance, assuming the worst without cause. As the tension mounted, Marcus's mind raced. He knew that no matter what he said, it wouldn't matter. He and his family were being judged solely by the color of their skin. The situation took a sharp turn as the officers moved with increasing aggression. One officer, his face twisted in suspicion, reached for Marcus's arm and forcefully pulled him toward the back of a police car. "You're being detained," he said coldly, as the metal cuffs clicked shut around Marcus's wrists. The sudden motion left Marcus momentarily stunned, but he quickly regained his composure. He knew this wasn't just an ordinary traffic stop. It was something much deeper. Still, he remained calm, trying to keep control of the situation. Tamara gasped, her hand instinctively reaching out for Marcus, but the officer stepped between them. "Stay back," he ordered. Fear began to well up inside her, but she did her best to keep it in check, turning to her children. "Stay calm," she whispered to Xavier and Mia, but inside, her heart raced. Xavier looked on, frozen with confusion, while Mia's face showed pure disbelief. The officers were now forcing Xavier and Mia out of the car one by one, pulling them apart from their parents and putting them in separate police vehicles. Tamara was helpless, her voice shaking as she tried to argue. "What's going on? We're just a family on vacation." But her words had no impact. She too was handcuffed and placed in another vehicle. The family was now separated, each of them thrown into different police cars, their sense of unity broken in an instant. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Marcus's wrists as he was shoved into the back of the patrol car. His mind raced, but he fought to keep his composure. He had been through tense situations before, but this was different. This was personal, and the weight of it hit him harder than he expected. As the patrol car sped toward the station, the Williams family sat in stunned silence. The air in the back of the police vehicles felt thick with fear. Tamara kept her eyes on the road ahead, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The questions in her mind swirled, but the uncertainty of the situation prevented her from finding any answers. Xavier sat with his head lowered, his hands resting in his lap. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, unsure whether to cry, scream, or ask the officers what was going on. He had never imagined that something as simple as a family vacation could turn into such a nightmare. His thoughts raced, each one darker than the last. Why are they doing this to us? Why us? The questions echoed in his mind, but there were no answers. His eyes flicked toward the backseat window, but he couldn't see beyond the metal bars. Mia, on the other hand, was visibly shaking. She had always been the more sensitive of the two children, her mind attuned to the emotional currents around her. She felt the tension in the air, the weight of the injustice pressing down on her. "What did we do wrong?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but the question hung in the air, unanswered. The sight of her parents, once calm and confident, now shackled and separated from her, made the situation feel surreal. Marcus, meanwhile, tried to make sense of it all. His FBI training had prepared him for many things: high-speed chases, dangerous situations, and complex investigations. But this was a violation, plain and simple. The officers had no justification for their actions, and yet they acted as though they had every right to detain his family. His mind drifted to the deeper implications of what had just occurred: an entire family targeted and detained simply because of their race. The journey to the station felt like it lasted an eternity. Every second that passed only deepened the family's confusion and fear. Their vacation, which had begun as a moment of relief, had now become a nightmare from which they could not wake. Upon arriving at the police station, the family was escorted into separate holding cells, the cold metal doors clanging shut behind them. The officers did not explain why they had been detained, nor did they offer any justification for their actions. Instead, they simply turned away, leaving the Williams family to sit in confusion and fear. In the holding cell, Marcus's frustration grew. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice now stern. "You've got no right to treat us this way." He had shown his FBI badge, tried to explain the situation, and yet nothing had changed. The officers ignored him, their suspicion of him and his family still apparent in their eyes. The officers continued to argue among themselves, their whispers barely audible through the cell bars. Marcus overheard bits of their conversation, fragments of accusation that made no sense. They questioned why a black family would be in this town, why they seemed out of place. They asked if Marcus was really an agent, or if he was just playing a role. The implication was clear. This was not about breaking the law, it was about their race. The officers had already decided that the Williams family was involved in something illegal, even though they had no evidence to support such a claim. The officers' accusations grew more absurd as time passed. They speculated that Marcus was hiding something, that his family must be part of some criminal scheme because they didn't fit in with the area. This was not just a simple misunderstanding. It was racial profiling at its core. The officers didn't need any real justification. Their assumptions, based solely on the color of the Williams family's skin, were enough. Marcus clenched his fists, fighting to keep his emotions in check. His years of experience in law enforcement had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but this was different. He knew what this was, and he knew what had to be done. The officer's growing suspicion, based on nothing more than bias, was a harsh reminder that racism could still manifest in the most unexpected places, and it could affect even those who were supposed to protect and serve. Hours passed in the cold, uncomfortable holding cells. The family sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The hum of the fluorescent lights, The distant clatter of footsteps from officers and the occasional murmur of voices were the only sounds in the otherwise quiet station. The Williams family had grown increasingly uneasy. There had been no explanation, no answers, just the constant uncertainty of why they were being treated this way. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, an officer came into Marcus's cell. He seemed more agitated than usual, and Marcus's suspicions grew. "What is this about?" he asked sharply, his frustration growing as his patience wore thin. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, looking at the file in his hand. Then, without warning, the officer muttered under his breath, "Let's see if this checks out." He turned and walked out of the cell, leaving Marcus with a rising sense of unease. A few minutes later, the officer returned, his demeanor completely different. The tone had shifted, no longer dismissive but somewhat apprehensive. He was holding a phone in his hand. "Marcus Williams," the officer said, staring at the name on his notepad. "You're with the FBI, aren't you?" Marcus nodded, his heart sinking as he realized that the officers had just discovered his identity. "I told you that earlier," he replied, trying to remain calm despite the growing anger inside him. The officer's face flushed as he quickly turned to radio for confirmation. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before the officer returned with the truth. "This is a mistake. You really are who you say you are," the officer said, almost begrudgingly. The shift in the room was immediate. The hostility, the aggressive questioning, the assumption that Marcus and his family were criminals, it all came crashing down. The officer stepped back, unsure of how to proceed, while Marcus couldn't help but feel the sting of how quickly things had turned from suspicion to discovery. What had just happened wasn't an honest mistake. It was a deeply ingrained bias that had led to everything unfolding the way it had. The shift in tone from the officers was almost immediate. Within minutes, the room that had been filled with tension now echoed with hurried footsteps. A different officer entered, and his posture was entirely different from the one who had previously been hostile. This officer now stood almost apologetically in front of Marcus's cell. "We've made a mistake," he said quickly, his voice tight. "We're sorry for the inconvenience." The apology came so quickly without much thought that it felt like an afterthought. The words hung in the air, but they were empty. They lacked any real sincerity. It was clear to Marcus that the officers were only apologizing because they had no choice, not because they genuinely understood the gravity of what had just occurred. Tamara, who had been sitting in her own cell, overheard the conversation and leaned forward, trying to make sense of the situation. "What do you mean, a mistake?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "What about what you put us through?" The officer, looking increasingly uncomfortable, did not answer her directly. Instead, he nodded to the others, signaling for them to release the family. But the apology felt hollow. There was no acknowledgement of the humiliation they had endured, no recognition of the fear they had been forced to feel. The entire situation seemed like an attempt to smooth things over with the bare minimum of effort, and Marcus could see through it. He knew that the officers were not apologizing because they had learned something important. They were apologizing because their error had been exposed, and now they had to clean up the mess they had created. As the family was escorted out of the holding cells, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. The officers made no effort to explain how this all began. They offered no answers about why they had been targeted in the first place. Instead, they simply opened the doors and motioned for the family to leave. Marcus and Tamara exchanged a glance, one that said everything without words. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. The realization hit them both at the same time. This wasn't a case of bad luck or poor judgment. It was racism. The officers had made assumptions based solely on their race, and that was why they had been detained in the first place. Tamara could feel the anger rising in her chest as she looked at her children. They were still shaken, still unsure of what had just happened, but they were learning something they shouldn't have to learn. The world was telling them that they were judged for things beyond their control, things as basic as the color of their skin. For Marcus, the feeling was even more complex. He had spent his entire career working within the justice system, fighting for what was right. Yet here he was, victimized by the very system he had worked so hard to protect. He had dedicated his life to serving his country, and now, in the blink of an eye, that same system had failed him and his family. "Are we really free to go?" Tamara asked, her voice trembling as she stared at the officer who had been so quick to apologize. The officer nodded, but his expression was far from reassuring. "Yes, you're free to go," he said flatly. But his words didn't erase what had happened. The emotional toll, the fear, the humiliation, the realization of the deep-seated prejudice they had faced, would stay with the Williams family long after they left the station. As they walked out of the building, Marcus took a deep breath. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that this kind of injustice was a thing of the past. But now he knew the truth. Racism wasn't just a history lesson. It was something people faced every day. And for the Williams family, this vacation would become a painful reminder of that. Once the news broke about the wrongful detainment of the Williams family, public outrage spread like wildfire. The story, first reported by a local news outlet, quickly gained traction across the country. It didn't take long for national media outlets to pick it up, with reporters demanding answers from the police department. Social media, too, erupted with support for the Williams family. People from all walks of life shared their shock, disbelief, and anger at the way the family had been treated. Protests began to form in the town, calling for accountability. Signs with phrases like "End racial profiling" and "Justice for the Williams family" filled the streets. Civil rights groups rallied behind the family, offering legal support and helping to organize marches in major cities. The public's response was swift, condemning the actions of the officers and shining a harsh spotlight on the police department's practices. Marcus, Tamara, Xavier, and Mia became symbols of the systemic racial injustice that still persisted in the country. Their story resonated with many, particularly within Black communities, who saw their own experiences reflected in what the family had endured. The anger was palpable, but so was the sense of solidarity. People across the nation demanded change, from police reform to more extensive training on racial bias, and they weren't willing to let this incident be swept under the rug. As the public outcry grew louder, the police department was forced to respond. An internal investigation was launched into the conduct of the officers involved in the wrongful detainment. The officers were placed on administrative leave while the department reviewed their actions. This investigation, however, felt more like a formality than a real effort to get to the truth. The damage had already been done, and the public knew it. The investigation revealed the obvious, that the officers had acted based on racial profiling. Their initial suspicions, unfounded and discriminatory, had led to the wrongful arrest of an innocent family. But the investigation stopped short of addressing the larger issue, the culture within the department that allowed such actions to take place in the first place. There was no deep dive into why these biases existed, no real exploration of how to prevent such incidents in the future. Despite the department's attempt to restore some sense of order, the fallout remained. The officers involved were reprimanded, and some faced disciplinary actions. However, many felt that the consequences were insufficient given the gravity of the situation. The Williams family's trauma was far deeper than any punishment the officers could face. The public's response was a reminder that this was not just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem that needed to be addressed on a national scale. Despite the investigation's findings, the family's lives would never return to normal. Though the media attention died down and the officers faced consequences, the emotional toll on the Williams family was far from over. Marcus, once confident and composed in his role as an FBI agent, found himself grappling with anger and disillusionment. The experience had shaken him to his core. He had dedicated his life to law enforcement, only to find that the very system he had worked for had turned on him and his family. Despite the external resolution, Marcus struggled to come to terms with the deep sense of betrayal. He couldn't shake the thought that the officers had treated him like a criminal simply because of his race. Tamara, too, found it hard to move on. As a mother, she had always worried about the safety of her children, but this incident made those fears even more real. The image of her children being pulled from the car, separated from her and Marcus, haunted her. She struggled with feelings of helplessness and vulnerability. Her faith in the system, once strong, now felt fragile and uncertain. The emotional scars of that day remained, and no apology could undo the damage that had been done. Xavier, who had always been a confident and driven young man, found it difficult to trust law enforcement after the incident. His dreams of attending college on a basketball scholarship were still within reach, but his confidence had been shaken. The encounter had made him more cautious, and he found it hard to shake the belief that his skin color had played a role in what had happened. The experience made him question how much of his future success could be impacted by forces beyond his control. Mia, ever the observer, found herself changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her passion for photography had always been about capturing the beauty of the world, but after the incident, her lens became focused on documenting injustice. The events surrounding her family's arrest had sparked something inside her, a desire to tell stories that mattered, to raise awareness about the systemic racism that continued to plague the country. She started photographing protests, speaking out on social media, and using her art to push for change. As a family, they tried to move forward, but the shadows of that day continued to linger. The emotional scars were not something that could be easily healed. The impact of the wrongful detainment would remain with them forever, no matter what happened in the aftermath. The aftermath of the incident transformed each member of the Williams family in profound ways. For Marcus, the experience had shattered his belief in the system he had spent his career upholding. His years of service in the FBI had always been rooted in the idea that justice would prevail, that the law would protect the innocent. But this event had forced him to face an uncomfortable truth. The system could be just as flawed as the people within it. Marcus's anger, initially bottled up, began to fuel something larger. He turned his pain into activism, becoming a vocal advocate for racial justice and law enforcement reform. He spoke at rallies, attended meetings with civil rights organizations, and used his platform as an FBI agent to shed light on the issue of racial profiling. The incident had ignited a fire within him, a determination to ensure that what happened to his family would not be forgotten. He had spent his career protecting and serving, but now his focus had shifted to fighting for a system that truly served everyone equally, regardless of their race. Tamara's transformation, however, was more internal. As a mother, she had always worried about her children's safety, but this event made those fears even more real. The thought of her children being pulled from their car and placed in separate vehicles with no explanation had left an indelible mark on her. She became more cautious, more protective. Her constant worry for her family deepened, and she found herself questioning whether the world would ever see her children as safe and equal. Xavier, too, felt the weight of what had happened. He had always been focused on his future, driven by the goal of securing a college basketball scholarship. But after the incident, his perspective began to shift. He started to realize that his future wasn't just shaped by his abilities, it was also shaped by how others saw him. The encounter had made him more aware of the obstacles he could face, simply because of the color of his skin. Yet, in the midst of this realization, he found strength. He began to channel his energy into using his voice to stand against racial injustice, pushing himself to become not just a successful athlete, but a role model for others who had faced similar struggles. Mia, always the sensitive one, found herself profoundly changed by what she had witnessed. Her passion for photography, which had once been focused solely on capturing the beauty of the world around her, now took on a deeper purpose. The event had opened her eyes to the harsh realities of injustice. She realized that her camera could be more than just a tool for documenting her surroundings. It could be a weapon for change. She began to capture images of protests, injustices, and the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. Her art became a platform for raising awareness about the systemic racism she had never fully understood until that moment. Marcus's transformation into an advocate for racial justice and law enforcement reform was swift and unrelenting. His position within the FBI had always given him access to powerful circles, but now he used that access to push for significant change. He attended meetings with lawmakers, discussed policy changes with activists, and worked closely with civil rights organizations to ensure that the lessons from his family's experience would not be forgotten. He focused particularly on law enforcement training, advocating for programs that taught officers about racial biases and the dangers of profiling. Marcus knew firsthand how damaging these biases could be, and he was determined to use his platform to create a more just system. His public speeches often highlighted the need for systemic change, urging both the public and law enforcement agencies to hold themselves accountable. He didn't want to be a bystander in a broken system. He wanted to be a catalyst for its repair. Tamara, while not as vocal as Marcus, also played her part in the movement. Her role was more focused on her community, on educating others, and raising awareness about the impact of racial profiling. She began speaking at local schools, sharing her family's story to encourage others to stand up against injustice. Though her activism was quieter, it was no less powerful. She became a trusted voice in her community, helping to bridge the gap between the affected and those who were unaware of the ongoing issues of racial bias. Mia's transformation was perhaps the most profound. The young photographer, who had once focused on the natural beauty of the world, now turned her lens toward the struggles of those around her. Her photographs, once filled with tranquil landscapes and quiet moments, began to focus on the raw realities of life: protests, the anger of communities, and the faces of people who had been hurt by the system. Mia's camera became her tool for raising awareness, a way to share the stories that often went untold. Her work gained attention as her photographs were shared online and featured in local exhibitions. What had started as an act of personal catharsis, capturing the pain and injustice her family had experienced, soon became a movement. Mia's photographs not only documented the struggles of her community, but also inspired others to share their stories, to use their voices in the fight for justice. She was no longer just a budding artist. She had become a storyteller, someone who used her art to challenge the status quo. The incident had shaped her into an advocate in her own right, someone whose work had the power to change perspectives and spark conversations. The Williams family's experience left an indelible mark on their lives. What began as a simple vacation turned into a traumatic event that would shape their futures in ways they never anticipated. The incident exposed not just the biases of a few officers, but the larger systemic racism that continues to affect Black families across the country. For the Williams family, this was no longer just an isolated event. It was a reflection of a deeply ingrained problem that reached far beyond the confines of one small town. The community's response, while a step toward accountability, could not erase the scars left on Marcus, Tamara, Xavier, and Mia. The pain of being judged by the color of their skin, the fear and confusion that accompanied their wrongful detainment, would stay with them forever. The damage was done, but it sparked a conversation, one that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about racism and inequality. Yet, even in the face of such adversity, the Williams family emerged stronger. Marcus, Tamara, Xavier, and Mia each found their own path to healing, and in doing so, they became voices for change. Their story is not just one of pain, it is one of resilience, of fighting back against a system that too often fails to protect the most vulnerable. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always room for hope and transformation. As Marcus continued to advocate for law enforcement reform and racial justice, and Mia used her photography to capture the reality of racial injustice, they showed that the fight for equality is far from over, but it is a fight worth taking on. The Williams family's journey is a testament to the power of determination and to the strength that can be found even in the aftermath of trauma. The story of the Williams family is not just theirs to tell, it is everyone's. It serves as a call to action for all of us to challenge the biases we encounter, to question the systems that perpetuate injustice, and to stand up for those who are often silenced. Racism is not just a problem for the affected, it is a societal issue that requires collective action. We must all do our part to ensure that the fight for racial justice continues. Whether it's speaking out against discrimination, supporting organizations that work toward change, or educating ourselves and others, every action counts. The Williams family story is a reminder that we can create a world where equality isn't just an ideal, but a reality. The time for change is now, and it starts with each of us.